Greetings, lovers of lore. Thank you for joining me for the second installment of the Dominaria United story as it unfolds. In the previous installment of the story, we left with Karn trapped under that massive weight of rocks, unable to planeswalk or do anything other than linger on thoughts of Phyrexia. And that's actually where the story picks up. Karn has been trapped under these rocks in darkness for an amount of time that he can't properly sort out. He doesn't know if it's been days, weeks, months. He's just laying there thinking about the Phyrexians, his friends, the Dominarians, the people that he could do nothing for. And what if the Phyrexians came back to get him? These thoughts were interrupted by sand trickling down onto him, and there was sound coming from above, accompanied by the weight lifting ever so slightly off of part of his hand. And at the same time, something warm briefly touched up against him and then was gone. It touched him long enough that he was able to determine that it definitely was not of Phyrexian origin. There were then some scratching sounds and rocks started flying. Karn could hear them, smaller rocks, then bigger rocks, and slowly but surely, he felt the weight lessen on him. And at a certain point, he realized he could start to strain against it. But he moved cautiously at first. He didn't want to hurt his rescuer. But once he heard the sound of someone moving away, he knew that he could stand up and just did so, brushing all the rocks and dust off of him, looking up to find out that his rescuer was actually a Johnny standing there with a smile on his face. Now, Karn was hesitant, so he gave him an unsure nod back. He had only really met a Johnny a few times. He looked at a Johnny. "How did you find me?" "I told no one where I was." A Johnny explained that Joyra was worried about Karn. He hadn't responded to the letters that she had sent them. And what she had actually done was have Raf Capuchin cast a tracking spell on the letters. And those spells activated each time Karn opened up the letter. They basically keyed to him. And every time he moved those letters around, Joyra would be aware of it. So she knew that he had the letters and she knew that he was shuffling them around somehow. But at a certain point, once Karn was trapped under the rocks, obviously, he's no longer in his camp anymore. He's not moving the papers around anymore. And so after those letters stopped moving at all for a while, that's when Joyra got really worried and asked Johnny to come out and take a look and gave him the rough idea of the area that Karn was in. Now, Karn was embarrassed for a couple of different reasons. One, that Joyra had known that he had read the letters and had not bothered to respond to them. So Karn inquired about Joyra. Is she safe? And Johnny explained to him, yes, she is safe over on the Mana Rig, and the Weatherlight is actually now in the hands of Sisay's descendant, Shanna. The entire time they were having this conversation, Karn was comically trying to remove a spear that had been lodged in his body with no real luck. One of the Society of Mishra drudges had jammed it into him during the fight, and it had partially broken off, and there was no way he could manage to free it out of his inner joints because his big metallic fingers just weren't up to the task. So Johnny politely asks if he can give Karn some assistance in this regard, and using some nimble cat fingering, he manages to get the spear out. Johnny then asks Karn, what exactly happened here? But Karn, because of what he was told about the Phyrexians and their far-reaching influence, is untrusting. Anyone could be a Phyrexian. So instead, Karn diverts by asking, how long have I been trapped down here? And Johnny tells him grimly, you've been down here for 2 months. Now this rocked Karn. He was not prepared for this. This meant that the Phyrexians had a 2-month head start on top of all the preparation that they had already done. But Karn put that aside when he noticed that Johnny's hand was hurt from digging him out. Let's return to camp so you can get that taken care of. And Karn didn't mention this out loud, but he wanted to get back and make sure that the Sylex and the copper tablet hadn't disappeared. He had nothing to worry about because when he got back to the camp, it was evident that no one had been there. It was completely undisturbed to the point where the tents had actually mildewed over. So Karn went about casually looking around the area where the Sylex was without really looking directly at it, because he didn't want to let Ajani know that he was really concerned about what was located in the encampment. So he made it seem like he was really just out to find this barrel of water and a rag for Ajani to be able to clean up his wounds. After Ajani had tended to his hand, he said, "Why are you here, Karn?" So Karn explained, "I'm here on an artifact hunt. The caves of Koilos are mostly untouched." And then he went on to explain the presence of the Phyrexians that he found. And Ajani, obviously being very alarmed by this, says, "Karn, we have to go and tell everyone immediately about this." But Karn still doesn't trust Ajani. So he shrugs and says, "There's no proof left. It's all been destroyed, and they wouldn't believe me before without proof." But Ajani is dogged about it. Holding the broken spear, he says, "Look, we can at least go to the peace summit that's happening between the Keldans and the Benelish. We can talk to the leaders that are there and try and get them on board." Karn agrees to this and says, "Let me get my things," gathers up the Sylex, the copper tablet, and everything else he wants to bring with him. And then Ajani pulls out his amulet to summon the Weatherlight. But Karn says, "That's not going to be fast enough. Let's just planeswalk there directly." Ajani agrees, and they end up arriving in a field of flowers. So Karn says, "Do you know where this meeting is supposed to take place?" And Ajani cocks his ear and says, "My best bet is we just follow the sound of arguing." Now, Karn couldn't hear a thing, so he was genuinely marveling at Ajani's sense of hearing. They end up finding the meeting just as it's starting. You have Arada and her Keldan warriors leading one nation. You've got Aaron Capuchin of Benalia, and there was also a contingent from New Archive that was part of this meeting as well to operate as kind of arbitrators. And as they arrived, there were other arrivals too. Joda, the ancient 5,000-year-old mage, stepped through a portal, and Jaya Ballard planes walked in with a puff of brimstone smoke. She looked over at Karn and Ajani. "I'm surprised to see you guys here." And Ajani lets her know the Phyrexians have returned to Dominaria. That proclamation basically silences the entire room, but only for a moment, and then everyone starts panicking and yelling, and there's absolute chaos. Now, Joda had been brokering this peace agreement for some time, so he basically was somewhat annoyed by this interruption and tried to get the meeting back on track. He says it's already been established that the Phyrexians cannot travel through the blind eternity, so what you're saying makes no sense here, okay? And the Phyrexians also, even if they were here, what they like to do is divide and conquer. So it makes absolutely no sense to interrupt this peace treaty that is being forged between two nations when that's exactly what Phyrexia would want us to do. So after Joda makes that very valid point, everyone turns back to the meeting, and Karn and Ajani depart to head off to Karn's quarters so they can discuss things further. And Karn says to Ajani, "If we can locate the Phyrexians and actually find proof, we'll be able to get the others to help us." So Karn magicked up a special scrying device made of copper and crystal. To make it function, you had to focus on the essence of someone. So he showed Ajani how it functioned by focusing on the essence of Joyra and what made Joyra Joyra. And by doing so, he was able to pull up an image of her in the mana rig. She was busy working away at some project on her workbench. So Ajani looked at him and said, "Can you do the same thing with Sheoldred?" And Karn instantly shifted his mind to Sheoldred, but the image of Joyra just floated away into mistiness, and Sheoldred and any Phyrexians were nowhere to be seen. So they determined that they must be using some sort of magic to protect them against scrying. Ajani at that point turns to Karn and gives him the amulet to summon the Weatherlight and says, "You're probably going to need this more than me." Karn studies it really quickly, delves into it with his magic, and basically instantaneously generates a perfect replica of it and hands the original back to Ajani, so they both now have one of these summoning amulets. At that point, they head back to the meeting, and Karn had noticed something at this point. There was this black thrush, and it was there when he originally showed up in the meeting, and it was still here. And normally, birds are more flighty creatures, and at certain points, when Karn was speaking, it almost felt like the bird was looking at him. So it was something that was kind of floating around in the back of his mind when he walked back into the room. What is that bird still doing here? The treaty was almost done at this point, right? They've almost hammered it all out when, unfortunately, Teferi comes planeswalking right into the middle of the meeting room looking for these other planeswalkers. When asked what he's doing there, Teferi immediately says, "The Phyrexians found their way to Kamigawa." At this point, the room again bursts into tumultuous craziness. Everyone's yelling and going crazy. The only exception to this are all the Benelish guards along the walls, right? They never freaked out the first time. They're not freaking out this time. They're keeping cool. But everyone else is going nuts now because what Karn was saying was easier to wave away. But now Teferi showed up and confirmed that the Phyrexians have shown up on multiple different planes. So while Karn was annoyed that people weren't willing to take his word for it, he's ultimately just happy that that means everyone is going to be in alignment. But there's a new problem now. Teferi showing up put the treaty in jeopardy. All of a sudden, Radha and Aaron are kind of backpedaling, and they're no longer walking in lockstep in terms of this treaty. So at that point, Joda basically is giving a pleading look to Jaya, "Help me out here." And Jaya gets Karn and Ajani to grab Teferi and get him on out of the room. So once they're further away, Teferi confides in Karn and Ajani and says, "Hey, I didn't want to tell everybody here what's going on, but the Phyrexians have Tamio, and they've completed her." Now, Ajani was stunned by this. He just stood there as shock and rage contested with each other in his body. And Karn basically immediately departed at that point. He had to go and take a look and see if the Sylex was still okay, because he hadn't had an opportunity yet to look at it. So once he pulled it out and realized it was fine, he also realized that it had to be put somewhere safe. He didn't know who he could trust or what he could do. So he snuck out of the city to a range where none of the other planeswalkers would be able to feel him planeswalking. And then he slipped over to the mana rig where Joyra was while she was asleep. And in one of the supply closets in her workshop, behind a big pile of dusty pipes, he laid the chest in there with sentry magic placed so that either the pipes were moved or the chest would move. He would be instantaneously notified. And then he planeswalked right back over to where the meeting was taking place and actually found Sten, the representative for the new Argive contingent. He was out there looking for Karn because it turns out that he actually had a mission that Karn was not aware of. So Sten says, "You are immune to Phyrexian influence. Is that right?" And Karn confirms. Sten says, "Okay, that means you're literally the only one that we can trust because anybody else is suspect. King Darian has secretly set me to root out Phyrexian agents. Basically, these agents don't even know they're sleepers." And Karn was stunned by this. He hadn't considered that possibility. When you think about it, though, it makes perfect sense. Considering all of these sleeper agents are going to have to work against their friends and families, knowing all that would create clear cognitive dissonance. So, to make sure they're proper when they get activated, they literally have no knowledge of their existence. So Sten says that New Argive is with you, Karn, right? And Karn is pleased now because they have at least one nation that is allied with them. So Karn, Ajani, Jaya, and Teferi all meet to discuss the Sylex. And Karn explains that he no longer has the Sylex. It's been put somewhere safe. And he talks about how he plans to, basically, he was looking for information to sort out how the Sylex works so he can use it to destroy New Phyrexia. New Phyrexia was originally the world of Mirrodin that Karn was responsible for creating. So as the creator of the world, and the reason that the Phyrexian oil found its way there, because it was actually nestled within Karn, and he's the reason that Mirrodin got infected and converted into New Phyrexia, he feels responsible to take it out. So he's basically planning to use the Sylex to wipe it out. Teferi at this point is saying, "Karn, we've talked about this. You can't do this alone." And Karn is accusatory and hurt at this point and said, "Look, you all said that you were going to help me with this. I am no longer waiting. I'm going to make this happen." So Karn is in like full go mode while the other planeswalkers still want to hold back. But Karn's philosophy is as soon as he can figure out how to make the Sylex work, he's going to use it to wipe out the entirety of New Phyrexia. Now, at this point, Karn notices that black thrush that he had seen in multiple locations, it's here as well. It's on the windowsill. And the thing is, there's another bird on the windowsill that thrush should normally be afraid of. So Karn just reaches out and grabs the thrush by the neck. I know what you are. And he starts to crush it, right? And that's when the beast reveals its Phyrexian nature, and crazy, slimy, bloody cables whip out of it and wires, and they all start clawing at Karn's face, and it's not really getting any purchase with the wires and things, but the slime that's all along the cables is corrosive. So it starts corroding Karn's silver body and eating into it painfully. And at the same time, all these needles are jutting out of the bird's head, trying to snap into Karn's neck. But unfortunately for the bird, the gear isn't up to the task and Karn's body's too strong. So they all end up breaking off in the attempt. So they end up essentially capturing this Phyrexian bird in a metal cage that's made by Karn, because they're in a room full of Phyrexians. One Phyrexian bird doesn't really stand a chance. And now Karn, armed with proof that the Phyrexians are here, he basically storms back into the meeting room with this cage with the Phyrexian bird in it, right? And again, we have this tumultuous insanity where everyone starts yelling and screaming, but the Benelish guards remain stoic and they stay around the edges. But then all of a sudden, 3 of them step forward and their eyes explode, boom, in massive waves of Phyrexian oil, and their bodies burst out into Phyrexian monstrosities. And one grabs Aaron Capuchin and lifts him in the air, and another one says, "The negotiations are over." And then Joda summons up this massive force field to try and protect the rest of the Benelish and the people who are there. And all of the different soldiers from the different communities join into the battle, right? And the Phyrexians are doing crazy maneuvers. One even splits in half when someone charges at him. He splits in 2 different halves, and the 2 halves start battling independently, like that jaguar from the old Astro Boy cartoon. I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about, but it's got that vibe, right? They basically, the planeswalkers, do everything they can to evacuate all of the regular people out of the area. So they end up with, you just have the planeswalkers, you have Sten, and you have Joda. And so Jaya is flinging all this fire at the Phyrexians, trying to keep them at bay and burn them out, while Joda is gathering up all this power. And they're like, "Are you ready for a portal?" Joda's got the power, but he needs a secure location. So Sten suggests that they go to New Argive, specifically the Watchtower. It is a very secure location, free of Phyrexian influence. So Joda opens up a portal directly into the tower, and they all manage to get through the portal while Jaya's still sitting there flinging fire at them. And once everybody's through the portal, then Jaya does this massive flame blast that just sets them all on fire, and they're all burning away. But at the last second, Karn sees this black flash and realizes one of the Phyrexians actually made it through the portal with them. So as soon as Sten hears that, he activates the magic that puts the entire tower in lockdown. All the windows, all the doors, everything instantly seal up. The entire place gets super stuffy. And then he turns around and hands the key to Karn and says, "You're the only one that we can trust. Here's the key to keep this entire place locked down." Now it's a situation where they have to find and destroy this elusive Phyrexian who's already managed to disappear. And at this point, who can Karn even trust anymore? And that ends the 2nd installment of the Dominaria United lore. My friends, I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what we're doing here, you can support us by joining the Patreon or the channel membership. Thanks for coming by. See you guys tomorrow for the next installment. And remember, lore is life.